There's a person at every gathering who has perfected a very specific skill. The moment a phone comes up, they're gone. Not rude about it. Not dramatic. Just quietly out of frame, behind someone taller, half a step to the left, suddenly very interested in their drink. You've probably seen this person. You might be this person. Maybe you're the one who asks to see the photo before it gets posted anywhere. The one who deletes yourself out of a group shot with a quick, practiced apology. Sorry, just not feeling it today. As if today were the exception and not the rule. The one whose family albums have a strange, consistent gap running through them, year after year. Like, someone kept stepping out of the frame just before the shutter clicked. And here's the question worth sitting with. What exactly are they avoiding? Most people assume the answer is simple. They think they look bad. Insecure about a few pounds, a wrinkle, a bad angle. Case closed. But that explanation falls apart the moment you actually watch these people closely. Because plenty of them look perfectly fine in photos when they're finally caught in one. Some of them look great. And they still flinch. So the surface explanation, vanity, insecurity, simple self-consciousness, doesn't hold up. Something deeper is going on. Something that has less to do with how they look and much more to do with what a photograph actually does to a person. Because a photograph doesn't just capture a face. It freezes a moment and hands it back as evidence. And for some people, evidence is exactly what they can't stand to look at. Now, there's a specific type of person who avoids cameras, and understanding them means understanding a gap most people carry without ever naming it. The gap between who they are and who they think they're supposed to be. Psychologist Tory Higgins at Columbia University spent years studying this gap through what he called self-discrepancy theory. Higgins described how people carry multiple versions of themselves at once. The actual self, the self they actually are day to day, and the ideal self, the version they feel they're supposed to become. Research building on his work suggests that the wider that distance grows, the more a person experiences something close to quiet, chronic discomfort. Not panic, just a low hum of not quite enough. A photograph collapses that distance into a single frozen image. It doesn't show potential. It doesn't show effort or intention or the person they're becoming. It shows exactly what is right now, permanently. And for someone whose ideal self lives far away from their actual self, that permanence is unbearable. Not because they look wrong. Because the photo refuses to lie the way their imagination gets to lie every single day. That's why some people can accept a mirror. A mirror moves, updates, forgives, but freeze completely in front of a lens that doesn't. It's not vanity. It's a mismatch between the self they're managing to believe in and the self a photograph insists is real. And this shows up in small, easy-to-miss behaviors most people never connect to anything deeper. Checking a photo the second it's taken, before anyone else sees it. Asking for it to be deleted, not because it's unflattering exactly, but because something about it feels too accurate. Avoiding video calls where their own face sits in a little box on the screen, watching itself, all meeting long. None of that is about looking bad. It's the discomfort of being confronted, in real time, with the actual self instead of the managed, curated, imagined one they've gotten used to living inside. But here's something curious about this group specifically. They're often the ones who seem the most put together. Successful, articulate, composed. Because the discrepancy Higgins described isn't about failure, it's about distance. And plenty of people with real, visible accomplishments still carry a private, unspoken sense that the actual version of them hasn't quite caught up to the one they imagined they'd be by now. Pay attention to who reaches out to you. When nothing is wrong. When you have nothing to offer. When you're not in the middle of a crisis. When you're just existing. Those people are different from the ones who show up only when they need something. That difference matters more than most people realize. I go much deeper into it in what I've linked below. Description and first pinned comment. But there are other people who avoid the camera for a completely different reason. And this group is a little harder to spot because on the surface, they seem like the opposite of camera shy. These are the people who actually love photos, as long as they control every variable. The lighting, the angle, the number of takes. Give them 10 seconds of an unposed candid shot, though, and watch the panic arrive instantly. They'll ask you to delete it before you've even finished taking it. This isn't about avoiding the camera. It's about avoiding being seen without permission. Psychologists Barbara Fredrickson and Tommy N. Roberts, whose work has shaped decades of research on self-perception, described a pattern they called self-objectification, the experience of learning, often from a young age, to view your own body from the outside as something constantly being evaluated by other people's eyes. Their research, along with studies that followed it, suggests this habit of self-monitoring can become so automatic that a person starts managing their own appearance the way a stranger would judge it, almost constantly, without realizing they're doing it. For someone carrying that pattern, an unposed photo is not just an unflattering picture. It's a moment where the internal camera, the one they've been running on themselves for years, gets overridden by a real one they don't control. And that loss of control is the actual threat, not the image itself. That makes sense of something that used to look contradictory. Why someone can post dozens of curated photos and still visibly panic at a single unplanned one. It was never about being photographed. It was about who gets to decide the frame. This is often the person who takes 20 photos to get one they'll allow anyone else to see and deletes the other 19 without a second thought. From the outside, that looks like ordinary vanity, the kind everyone jokes about. But research on self-objectification suggests something more specific is running underneath, a lifetime of learning that their appearance is a thing to be managed on behalf of an audience, even when no audience is actually watching. Now flip it, because there's a nuance here that changes the whole reading of this group. Wanting control over how you're seen isn't automatically a red flag. Sometimes it's simply someone who has learned, the hard way, what it costs to be caught in a moment they didn't approve, an old photo used against them, a comment about their appearance they never forgot, an environment early on that taught them their image would be scrutinized either way. The instinct to control the frame can be less about vanity and more about a very reasonable form of self-protection, built inside a culture that has, for a long time, treated appearance as public property. And this connects to another important idea, one that reframes the entire subject. Because so far, avoiding cameras has looked like a problem to solve. But there's a third group, and this one is probably the most interesting because their avoidance isn't about appearance at all. This group doesn't flinch at how they look. They flinch at being included. Watch them at a family gathering. They'll happily take the photo. They'll never be in it. Ask them why and they'll laugh it off. I hate pictures of myself, they'll say, the same line everyone uses. But look closer, and the pattern isn't about the face in the photo. It's about not wanting to exist on record inside that particular group. Researcher June Tangney, whose work at George Mason University has shaped much of what's understood about shame, distinguishes shame from guilt in a way that matters here. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says something is wrong with me. Her research, along with decades of work that followed it, suggests that people carrying unresolved shame often develop a quiet instinct toward invisibility, not because they want to disappear from life, but because visibility feels like exposure, and exposure feels dangerous. For this group, a family photo isn't a picture. It's a document. Proof of belonging to something they may feel, deep down, they don't fully belong to, or don't deserve to be seen belonging to. And removing themselves from the frame becomes a way of managing a feeling they've never quite been able to name, let alone explain to anyone holding a camera. That's the strangest part of this entire pattern. The people who most avoid being photographed with others are often the ones who care the most about those relationships, not the least. Because indifference doesn't produce this kind of vigilance. Only attachment does. Because a person who truly didn't care wouldn't bother stepping out of frame. They'd just stand there. It's the ones still quietly hoping they belong who do the work of disappearing. Think about how specific this instinct is. It's rarely about every photo. It's the family reunion, the holiday table, the group shot at the reception, the ones that count as belonging somewhere permanently on record. A photo with coworkers or acquaintances rarely triggers the same reflex because there's nothing at stake in that frame. It's only the pictures tied to the relationships that actually matter where the disappearing act shows up. That alone tells you this was never about vanity. It's about the fear of being seen inside the exact group where being seen means the most. And little by little, without realizing it, that disappearing becomes a habit that outlives whatever caused it. The wound heals, the situation changes, the family dynamic that made them feel like an outsider might even resolve itself completely, and they're still stepping out of the frame, years later, on reflex. There was a version of you much younger who learned something important about being seen, that being noticed carried a cost, that blending in felt safer than standing out in a photograph someone might keep forever. You didn't decide that in a single moment. You absorb it slowly, watching how people reacted to attention, to praise, to being singled out in a room. There was a version of you much younger who learned something important about survival, that being needed was safer than being vulnerable, that being capable kept the peace, that asking for things made the room uncomfortable. You didn't learn that in a classroom. You learned it by watching, by feeling, by adapting. I've written about where this starts and how it follows us. Link in the description. And in the first pinned comment. Now, there's something that almost nobody talks about when it comes to this pattern, and it might be the most important part of the whole picture. Avoiding the camera isn't always the problem. Sometimes it's the healthiest response in the room. Because in a culture saturated with images, where every gathering gets documented and every version of yourself gets archived somewhere, choosing not to be captured can be an act of quiet self-respect, a boundary, not a wound. Not everyone who steps out of frame is running from shame. Some of them have simply decided that not every moment needs to become a record. The difference isn't in the behavior. It's in what's underneath it. One person steps out of frame because they've made peace with not documenting everything. Another steps out of frame because some part of them still doesn't believe they're allowed to take up that much space in the picture. And most people never talk about the difference because from the outside, both look identical. Same gesture, same joke about hating photos, same quiet exit before the flash goes off. But one comes from freedom, the other comes from fear. And only the person doing it usually knows which one it is, if they've ever stopped to ask. So, what's actually happening when you step out of the frame? Ask yourself honestly what you feel in that half second before you move. Is it ease, the simple preference of someone who just doesn't need to be documented right now? Or is it something tighter, a flinch, a bracing, a small silent argument with a version of yourself the camera might catch off guard? If it's ease, there's nothing here to fix. You already know that about yourself, and it's allowed to just be a preference. But if it's the other feeling, the tightness, the bracing, that's worth sitting with a little longer. Ask yourself what the photo would actually prove if it existed. That you don't look the way you think you should. That you were included somewhere you secretly doubt you belong. That the gap between who you are and who you meant to become by now is bigger than you'd like anyone to see clearly, all at once, in a single frame. Not to force yourself into every photo from now on. Just to notice what the camera seems to be threatening to reveal, and whether that threat is actually true anymore, or whether it's an old belief still running on a room that changed a long time ago. Because the distance Higgins described between who you are and who you think you should be, that distance can close. Slowly, and not because of a photograph, but because of what you decide to believe about the person the photograph actually shows. You are allowed to exist in the pictures. Not the improved version, not the version 10 pounds lighter or 5 years younger or finally as accomplished as you meant to be by now. The actual one. The one standing there, slightly awkward, half smiling, entirely real. Maybe that's really what separates people who eventually make peace with being seen from the ones who spend a lifetime managing the frame. Not confidence, exactly, but a willingness to let the actual self and the ideal self sit a little closer together without needing a filter to bridge the gap. If any part of this describes something you do, without ever having a name for it, say so in the comments, which type you recognized yourself in, or whether it was some combination of all three. Naming it tends to be the first thing that loosens its grip. And if this is the kind of thing you'd rather understand than just feel, stay close. There's a lot more sitting underneath the ordinary behaviors nobody bothers to explain, and unpacking it, one pattern at a time, is exactly what happens here next. Because somewhere right now, someone is stepping just out of frame before the shutter clicks. And for the first time, they might actually understand why.